Good morning, and welcome to this morning's sermon from the movie Inside Out. Before we begin the sermon this morning, I'd like to read two Psalms for you. The first is Psalm 34, verses 17 through 18. The righteous cry out, and the Lord hears them. He delivers them from their troubles. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Psalm 30 verse 5 says, "For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning." These are the words of God for the people of God, and we say, thanks be to God. So I want to start off by asking you some questions. When was the last time you felt angry? How about when was the last time you felt sad? For many of you, I'm sure it was this week, maybe even today. I know those feelings well. And this is part of our series on the movie Inside Out and mastering our emotions, or at least understanding them. God has emotions. We have emotions. These are facts. What's also a fact is that emotions can be helpful or they can be hurtful. Emotions can be useful, but also dangerous. So it's good to remember, emotions are hard. Last week we talked about two emotions that are characters from the movie, fear and disgust. Fear and disgust are very helpful to Riley. They help her know what is safe, what is good for her. But as we see in the movie, when left up to their own devices and when they're in control, fear can make Riley paralyzed and disgust can make her really judgmental. Today, I want to talk about two more characters from the movie, and they're actually my favorite characters from the movie, anger and sadness. Now, before you ask me, Pastor Nick, why in the world would anger and sadness be your favorites? I want you to remember them. What's sadness like? Well, she's blue, she's short, she's kind of awkward, and when she gets overwhelmed, she just collapses into a puddle. What's anger like? He's red, he's fiery, he always has an opinion, even if he doesn't need to speak his mind. He's very decisive, also kind of rash. So why would they be my favorites? Why not joy? Well, as much as I would love to say joy is my primary motivator, I often live with anger and sadness in my life. And they're not bad. Like fear and disgust, they too are guideposts that we should pay attention to. They help us find out what's meaningful to us. So let's look at them in different ways. In today's reading from the Psalms, we see anger and sadness and other emotions. And many of the Psalms we know were written by King David, and we're going to hear about more of his story later, about times that he felt big feelings like anger and sadness, or you could say rage and depression. These are synonyms for it. The good news about David is that he learns from his mistakes, and he often reflects on what he's felt and what he's experienced in the Psalms. So for all of my journalers and creative writers out there, it's really good for you. And if you read 2 Samuel, which carries a lot of the stories from David's life, you'll find many of these instances. Like when his son is seen as a competitor to the throne, David feels immense anger. And later on, when that same son is killed by one of David's generals, David feels immense sadness. But you're probably thinking, well, King David, isn't he most associated with joy? That whole story of him running through the streets nearly naked because he's just so happy. Well, that's the thing about emotions. We aren't always one emotion. Circumstances can change how we feel. And so let's look at that. And Inside Out, Riley is also most associated with happiness. We see it in the opening scene of the movie when joy appears when baby Riley opens her eyes. But things change. As we grow, we learn to feel different things. So even though joy is Riley's primary emotion, the change of moving to a new city, starting at a new school, really shakes her up. After having been embarrassed at school, she comes home and she just doesn't feel okay. And so sitting at the dinner table, we find out that Riley has lost a lot of her personality through these bad experiences. But if you pay attention, not everyone works and operates like Riley does, most notably her parents. In that same scene around the kitchen table, we get a glimpse into her parents' minds. First, we see Mom's thinking. All of her emotions are sitting at a nice, tidy desk, and they look to be very similar. Unlike Riley's emotions, which all look and act so different from each other, Mom's feelings all kind of look the same. They have the same hair. They're all paying attention. They're working as a team. But most notably, if you see at the helm, taking charge isn't joy like in Riley's mind. It's sadness in her mom's mind. Why sadness? Well, it's because Mom has grown up with her feelings. First off, she may have never had joy as her primary motivator, but as she's gotten older, the world has affected her. But it's not that she's sad or depressed. We see that her sadness has a powerful tool: empathy. Empathy is very similar to sadness. It brings us down to the valleys of life where we feel very deep things. But the purpose of empathy is to connect us with others through a shared sense of sadness so that we understand each other better. And that's what Mom tries to do with Riley. She wants to understand her daughter's pain. No matter where we come from, all of us have had sad experiences. We may not fully understand all the sadness in the world, but we at least know how to speak from our own. Ecclesiastes Chapter 1, verse 18 says, "For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." Now here's what that's saying. That knowing sadness, knowing what it is to feel pain, can be incredibly challenging, even worthy of that darker thing called grief. But it's important because it helps us mold into who we should be. Brene Brown, y'all know I love her, and many of you listen to her as well. She likes to make this phrase, feeling our feelings all the way through. That when we feel pain or any other great emotion, rather than trying to stop it, we should just feel it all the way through. And that's good for us because then we learn from it and we find out information about who we are and what we've been through. So this whole idea is that wisdom is born through sorrow and pain, but it's a tool towards compassion. This learning from our experiences and using that pain helps us to gain perspective into what others think and feel too. In his sermon on this topic, the Reverend Dion Fraser says, what we need to do when we feel sadness is not to be told our feelings of sadness don't matter, nor should we ignore them. That's what we often try to do. We try to immediately push sadness out of the way, to make it disappear. That happens in the movie. When Joy introduces us to sadness, she says, sadness doesn't really go anywhere. I've checked. Joy doesn't want her around. Throughout the movie, she tries to give sadness tasks, things to do that keep her out of the way. But what Reverend Fraser says is that we must be reminded that sadness doesn't need to go away. Usually all sadness needs is presence and affirmation from those who are with us. To be told, yeah, it's okay you feel that way. My buddy Stephen, who wrote this series with me, used this phrase in his sermon series on sadness, that sadness is the bridge back to joy. Throughout the movie, Joy tries to get rid of sadness, but it isn't until the end when sadness gets too depressed and tries to run away on her own that Joy realizes just how necessary sadness is. So let's return to that same scene with the parents. We also get a glimpse into Dad's brain, and we see something very similar with Dad that we see with Mom. His primary motivator isn't joy, but it's also not sadness. It's anger. But Dad's anger, like Mom's sadness, isn't just rage. It's got something else going on. What he tries to do is to keep the status quo. He wants to protect his happy daughter, and he wants her to go back to where she was so that their happy home can be happy again. He does make a mistake, though. He gets upset with her because she won't fall in line with his request. And when she gets a little bit of an attitude, he sends her to her room. Now, I feel a lot for Dad because, to be fair, he was really distracted. He was thinking about sports when he really should have been paying attention to his wife and daughter. But sometimes that's just what happens to people. I suffer from getting distracted all the time. And I hate to admit it, but my team captain often is anger as well. But unlike Riley's dad, whose anger is probably more set towards protectiveness to maintain the family, mine is about passion for right and wrong and for us to be a better people. All of us have emotions that carry the load most of the time, and they might be different from each other. Even though they're similar in one way, they might be very different in another way. So it's good for us to have compassion, not only with each other, but with ourselves, if we aren't the joyful, happy person maybe we all want to be. So what about you? What is your team captain at the emotional table? I'll let you think about that. So that was a lot of movie detail. Let's look at the Bible. One doesn't need to read much scripture to see evidence that God gets angry sometimes. In the various books of the prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos, God's anger is a constant presence. So much so that I've met many Christians who try to ignore a lot of the Old Testament stories about God in favor for a happier, more joyful New Testament God and his son, the gentle Jesus. But if you pay attention to the Gospels, there is evidence of Jesus getting angry. The most famous example being when Jesus visits the temple and finds people who are using it to get money from others who are not suspecting of their practices. Jesus flips tables of the money changers and gets a whip and whips them out. So when I was in seminary, I did have a professor say, when anyone ever asks you what would Jesus do, flipping tables and whipping fools is in the realm of possibility. But that's also a single story in Jesus' narrative. And those stories about God in the Old Testament are a small part of God's history. There are many, many stories of God that has love and empathy and compassion for the people, even patience. And this is included in David's story as well, even after David does something out of his poor emotional choices. Towards the end of 2 Samuel in chapter 24, we read about God's anger towards David. David has decided to take a census because of the influence of the heavenly prosecutor. That might sound odd to you, heavenly prosecutor, but you've run across this character before, especially if you've read the book of Job. There's another name or title that he goes by, Hasatan, the Satan. Yes, Satan is a title, not a name. And the Satan, the heavenly prosecutor, the adversary, to be more precise in language, convinces David to take this census, and that angers God. Why would God be angry about a census? We just went through one here in America. Hey, it took me 2 minutes. I did it online. It was super fast. Well, unlike our census, David's census had very different purpose. The census that we have helps us to be represented in our government. It does help figure out what taxes should be, but that's based on population. David's census had 3 purposes. Number 1, to find out just how much stuff everyone in his kingdom owned. Very different from ours. Number 2, it was run by the military, and these generals and commanders that were taking the census were trying to find out how many young men could wield a sword. And the 3rd was to get an idea of all the number of people who were able-bodied to perform labor. Resources, military, slavery. Yeah, that's a little dark, isn't it? David, of course, continues with the census, and God has cast judgment upon him. So he sends the prophet Gad to go speak to King David. And Gad offers David a choice amongst 3 punishments. Number 1, you could suffer a famine for 3 years. Number 2, you and your people could be on the run for 3 months as attackers and conquerors chase you. Or number 3, you can suffer a pestilence for 3 days. It's interesting how you see those threes, and especially how David had 3 reasons and God had 3 punishments. Well, here's why. A famine takes away those resources. Attackers take away your military might. And pestilence depletes your workforce. The symmetry is meant to be there and meant to be obvious. But what's important here is that David, rather than choosing his punishment, instead makes a different choice. He submits to God's decision, hoping for God's mercy. And so God chooses, sending a heavenly messenger or an angel to a high place in the city of Jerusalem. And the angel opens its mouth and a pestilence begins to come through. But something amazing happens here. God sees the damage, sees the hurt, the pain, the death, and something happens. God feels something. What is it? Sadness? Empathy? Regret? Before the 3 days is over, God calls the angel back. The people had suffered enough. David was right. He put his trust in God's mercy and compassion. And we find that God's mercy and compassion overrule God's sense of justice. So yes, in the Bible, even God can change God's mind. And that's a good thing. Emotions need our ability to change and adjust. We can't just act on everything we think when we think about it. We need our experiences to help us process, to understand, to adapt, so that we can be better people. In Riley's case, she's still young, but even through the course of just a movie, we see her grow through her emotions. Also, we see her parents who've had years of practice and how they have grown in their experience, how their emotions have changed, and even how they've developed teams so that their emotions work together. Emotions are hard. They can be controlling. They can take over everything else. It's easy, even incredibly human, to let a single emotion take over everything. To let disgust make us judgmental, to let fear make us paralyzed, to let sadness drop us into depression, and to let anger put us in blind rage. But we are also God's children, a God who can change his mind about what is happening. We are capable of being better because of who God is and who God is in us. We are capable of letting disgust and fear help us make safe choices. We are capable of letting our anger not put us into a rage, but help us find passion and things that are worth fighting for. And we can let our sadness not put us in depression, but make us empathetic and soft in heart towards the needs of others. Next week, we're going to finish this series by looking at joy, because yes, even joy can blind us to the truth of reality. But that's human joy. We'll learn about God's joy that's more profound, more fulfilling, and grounded in both what is and also what could be. So stay tuned and join us next time. See you soon.